Part 2, Chapter 6. Lebedeff's country house was not large, but it was pretty and convenient, especially the part which was let to the prince. A row of orange and lemon trees and jasmines, planted in green tubs, stood on the fairly wide terrace. According to Lebedeff, these trees gave the house a most delightful aspect. Some were there when he bought it, and he was so charmed with the effect that he promptly added to their number. When the tubs containing these plants arrived at the villa and were set in their places, Lebedeff kept running into the street to enjoy the view of the house, and every time he did so, the rent to be demanded from the future tenant went up with a bound. This country villa pleased the prince very much in his state of physical and mental exhaustion. On the day that they had left for Pavlovsk, that is, the day after his attack, he appeared almost well, though in reality he felt very far from it. The faces of those around him for the last 3 days had made a pleasant impression. He was pleased to see not only Colia, who had become his inseparable companion, but Lebedeff himself and all the family, except the nephew who had left the house. He was also glad to receive a visit from General Ivolgin before leaving St. Petersburg. It was getting late when the party arrived at Pavlovsk, but several people called to see the prince and assembled in the veranda. Gania was the first to arrive. He had grown so pale and thin that the prince could hardly recognize him. Then came Varia and Ptitsin, who were rusticating in the neighbourhood. As to General Ivolgin, he scarcely budged from Lebedeff's house, and seemed to have moved to Pavlovsk with him. Lebedeff did his best to keep Ardalion Alexandrovitch by him, and to prevent him from invading the prince's quarters. He chatted with him confidentially, so that they might have been taken for old friends. During those 3 days, the prince had noticed that they frequently held long conversations. He often heard their voices raised in argument on deep and learned subjects, which evidently pleased Lebedeff. He seemed as if he could not do without the general. But it was not only Ardalion Alexandrovitch whom Lebedeff kept out of the prince's way. Since they had come to the villa, he treated his own family the same. Upon the pretext that his tenant needed quiet, he kept him almost in isolation, and Myshkin protested in vain against this excess of zeal. Lebedeff stamped his feet at his daughters and drove them away if they attempted to join the prince on the terrace. Not even Vera was accepted. They will lose all respect if they are allowed to be so free and easy. Besides, it is not proper for them, he declared at last, in answer to a direct question from the prince. "Why on earth not?" asked the latter. "Really, you know, you are making yourself a nuisance by keeping guard over me like this. I get bored all by myself. I have told you so over and over again, and you get on my nerves more than ever by waving your hands and creeping in and out in the mysterious way you do." It was a fact that Lebedeff, though he was so anxious to keep everyone else from disturbing the patient, was continually in and out of the prince's room himself. He invariably began by opening the door a crack and peering in to see if the prince was there, or if he had escaped. Then he would creep softly up to the armchair, sometimes making Myshkin jump by his sudden appearance. He always asked if the patient wanted anything, and when the latter replied that he only wanted to be left in peace, he would turn away obediently and make for the door on tiptoe, with deprecatory gestures, to imply that he had only just looked in, that he would not speak a word, and would go away and not intrude again, which did not prevent him from reappearing in 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. Colia had free access to the prince, at which Lebedeff was quite disgusted and indignant. He would listen at the door for half an hour at a time while the two were talking. Colia found this out, and naturally told the prince of his discovery. "Do you think yourself my master, that you try to keep me under lock and key like this?" said the prince to Lebedeff. "In the country, at least, I intend to be free, and you may make up your mind that I mean to see whom I like, and go where I please." "Why, of course," replied the clerk, gesticulating with his hands. The prince looked him sternly up and down. "Well, Lukian Timofeyovitch, have you brought the little cupboard that you had at the head of your bed with you here?" "No, I left it where it was." "Impossible." "It cannot be moved. You would have to pull the wall down, it is so firmly fixed." "Perhaps you have one like it here?" "I have one that is even better, much better. That is really why I bought this house." "Ah, what visitor did you turn away from my door about an hour ago?" The general. I would not let him in. There is no need for him to visit you, prince. I have the deepest esteem for him. He is a great man. You don't believe it? Well, you will see. And yet, most excellent prince, you had much better not receive him." "May I ask why? And also why you walk about on tiptoe, and always seem as if you were going to whisper a secret in my ear whenever you come near me?" "I am vile, vile, I know it," cried Lebedeff, beating his breast with a contrite air. "But will not the general be too hospitable for you?" "Too hospitable?" "Yes. First he proposes to come and live in my house. Well and good. But he sticks at nothing. He immediately makes himself one of the family. We have talked over our respective relations several times, and discovered that we are connected by marriage. It seems also that you are a sort of nephew on his mother's side. He was explaining it to me again only yesterday. If you're his nephew, it follows that I must also be a relation of yours, most excellent prince. Never mind about that, it is only a foible. But just now he assured me that all his life, from the day he was made an ensign to the 11th of last June, he has entertained at least 200 guests at his table every day. Finally, he went so far as to say that they never rose from the table. They dined, supped, and had tea for 15 hours at a stretch. This went on for 30 years without a break. There was barely time to change the tablecloth. Directly one person left, another took his place. On feast days he entertained as many as 300 guests, and they numbered 700 on the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of the Russian Empire. It amounts to a passion with him. It makes one uneasy to hear of it. It is terrible to have to entertain people who do things on such a scale. That is why I wonder whether such a man is not too hospitable for you and me. But you seem to be on the best of terms with him. Quite fraternal. I look upon it as a joke. Let us be brothers-in-law, it is all the same to me. Rather an honour than not. But in spite of the 200 guests and the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Empire, I can see that he is a very remarkable man. I am quite sincere. You said just now that I always looked as if I was going to tell you a secret. You are right. I have a secret to tell you. A certain person has just let me know that she is very anxious for a secret interview with you. Why should it be secret? Not at all. I will call on her myself tomorrow." "No, oh no!" cried Lebedeff, waving his arms. "If she is afraid, it is not for the reason you think. By the way, do you know that the monster comes every day to inquire after your health? You call him a monster so often that it makes me suspicious." "You must have no suspicions, none whatever," said Lebedeff quickly. "I only want you to know that the person in question is not afraid of him, but of something quite different." "What on earth is she afraid of, then? Tell me plainly, without any more beating about the bush," said the prince, exasperated by the other's mysterious grimaces. "Ah, that is the secret," said Lebedeff with a smile. "Whose secret?" "Yours. You forbade me yourself to mention it before you, most excellent prince," murmured Lebedeff. Then, satisfied that he had worked up Myshkin's curiosity to the highest pitch, he added abruptly, "She is afraid of Aglaya Ivanovna." The prince frowned for a moment in silence, and then said suddenly, "Really, Lebedeff, I must leave your house. Where are Gavrila Ardalionovitch and the Ptitsins? Are they here? Have you chased them away too?" They are coming, and the general as well. I will open all the doors. I will call all my daughters, all of them, this very minute," said Lebedeff in a low voice, thoroughly frightened, and waving his hands as he ran from door to door. At that moment Colia appeared on the terrace. He announced that Lizaveta Prokofievna and her 3 daughters were close behind him. Moved by this news, Lebedeff hurried up to the prince. "Shall I call the Ptitsins and Gavrila Ardalionovitch? Shall I let the general in?" he asked. "Why not? Let in anyone who wants to see me. I assure you, Lebedeff, you have misunderstood my position from the very first. You have been wrong all along. I have not the slightest reason to hide myself from anyone," replied the prince gaily. Seeing him laugh, Lebedeff thought fit to laugh also, and though much agitated, his satisfaction was quite visible. Colia was right. The Epanchin ladies were only a few steps behind him. As they approached the terrace, other visitors appeared from Lebedeff's side of the house, the Ptitsins, Gania, and Ardalion Alexandrovitch. The Epanchins had only just heard of the prince's illness and of his presence in Pavlovsk from Colia, and up to this time had been in a state of considerable bewilderment about him. The general brought the prince's card down from town, and Mrs. Epanchin had felt convinced that he himself would follow his card at once. She was much excited. In vain the girls assured her that a man who had not written for 6 months would not be in such a dreadful hurry, and that probably he had enough to do in town without needing to bustle down to Pavlovsk to see them. Their mother was quite angry at the very idea of such a thing, and announced her absolute conviction that he would turn up the next day at latest. So next day the prince was expected all the morning, and at dinner, tea and supper, and when he did not appear in the evening, Mrs. Epanchin quarrelled with everyone in the house, finding plenty of pretexts, without so much as mentioning the prince's name. On the 3rd day there was no talk of him at all, until Aglaya remarked at dinner, "Mamma is cross because the prince hasn't turned up," to which the general replied that it was not his fault. Mrs. Epanchin misunderstood the observation, and rising from her place, she left the room in majestic wrath. In the evening, however, Colia came with the story of the prince's adventures, so far as he knew them. Mrs. Epanchin was triumphant, although Colia had to listen to a long lecture. He idles about here the whole day long. One can't get rid of him. And then, when he is wanted, he does not come. He might have sent a line if he did not wish to inconvenience himself." At the words, "One can't get rid of him," Colia was very angry, and nearly flew into a rage, but he resolved to be quiet for the time, and show his resentment later. If the words had been less offensive, he might have forgiven them, so pleased was he to see Lizabeta Prokofievna worried and anxious about the prince's illness. She would have insisted on sending to Petersburg at once for a certain great medical celebrity, but her daughters dissuaded her, though they were not willing to stay behind when she at once prepared to go and visit the invalid. Aglaya, however, suggested that it was a little unceremonious to go en masse to see him. "Very well, then, stay at home," said Mrs. Epanchin. "And a good thing too, for Evgenie Pavlovitch is coming down, and there will be no one at home to receive him." Of course, after this, Aglaya went with the rest. In fact, she had never had the slightest intention of doing otherwise. Prince S., who was in the house, was requested to escort the ladies. He had been much interested when he first heard of the prince from the Epanchins. It appeared that they had known one another before, and had spent some time together in a little provincial town 3 months ago. Prince S. had greatly taken to him, and was delighted with the opportunity of meeting him again. The general had not come down from town as yet, nor had Evgenie Pavlovitch arrived. It was not more than 200 or 300 yards from the Epanchins' house to Lebedeff's. The first disagreeable impression experienced by Mrs. Epanchin was to find the prince surrounded by a whole assembly of other guests, not to mention the fact that some of those present were particularly detestable in her eyes. The next annoying circumstance was when an apparently strong and healthy young fellow, well dressed and smiling, came forward to meet her on the terrace, instead of the half-dying unfortunate whom she had expected to see. She was astonished and vexed, and her disappointment pleased Colia immensely. Of course, he could have undeceived her before she started, but the mischievous boy had been careful not to do that, foreseeing the probably laughable disgust that she would experience when she found her dear friend the prince in good health. Colia was indelicate enough to voice the delight he felt at his success in managing to annoy Lizabeta Prokofievna, with whom, in spite of their really amicable relations, he was constantly sparring. "Just wait a while, my boy," said she. "Don't be too certain of your triumph." And she sat down heavily in the armchair pushed forward by the prince. Lebedeff, Ptitsin, and General Ivolgin hastened to find chairs for the young ladies. Varia greeted them joyfully, and they exchanged confidences in ecstatic whispers. "I must admit, Prince, I was a little put out to see you up and about like this. I expected to find you in bed, but I give you my word I was only annoyed for an instant, before I collected my thoughts properly. I am always wiser on second thoughts, and I dare say you are the same. I assure you I am as glad to see you well as though you were my own son. Yes, and more. And if you don't believe me, the more shame to you. And it's not my fault. But that spiteful boy delights in playing all sorts of tricks. You are his patron, it seems. Well, I warn you that one fine morning I shall deprive myself of the pleasure of his further acquaintance." "What have I done wrong now?" cried Colia. "What was the good of telling you that the prince was nearly well again? You would not have believed me. It was so much more interesting to picture him on his deathbed. "How long do you remain here, Prince?" asked Madame Epanchin. "All the summer, and perhaps longer." "You are alone, aren't you? Not married?" "No, I'm not married," replied the prince, smiling at the ingenuousness of this little feeler. "Oh, you needn't laugh. These things do happen, you know. Now then, why didn't you come to us? We have a wing quite empty. But just as you like, of course. Do you lease it from him? This fellow, I mean," she added, nodding towards Lebedeff. "And why does he always wriggle so?" At that moment, Vera, carrying the baby in her arms as usual, came out of the house onto the terrace. Lebedeff kept fidgeting among the chairs and did not seem to know what to do with himself, though he had no intention of going away. He no sooner caught sight of his daughter than he rushed in her direction, waving his arms to keep her away. He even forgot himself so far as to stamp his foot. "Is he mad?" asked Madame Epanchin suddenly. "No, perhaps he is drunk. Your company is rather peculiar," she added with a glance at the other guests. "But what a pretty girl! Who is she?" "That is Lebedeff's daughter, Vera Lukianovna." "Indeed, she looks very sweet. I should like to make her acquaintance." The words were hardly out of her mouth when Lebedeff dragged Vera forward in order to present her. "Orphans, poor orphans," he began in a pathetic voice. "The child she carries is an orphan too. She is Vera's sister, my daughter Lyubov. The day this babe was born, 6 weeks ago, my wife died, by the will of God Almighty. Yes, Vera takes her mother's place, though she is but her sister, nothing more, nothing more. And you are nothing more than a fool, if you'll excuse me. Well, you know that yourself, I expect," said the lady indignantly. Lebedeff bowed low. "It is the truth," he replied with extreme respect. "Oh, Mr. Lebedeff, I am told you lecture on the apocalypse. Is it true?" asked Aglaya. "Yes, that is so, for the last 15 years. I have heard of you, and I think read of you in the newspapers." "No, that was another commentator whom the papers named. He is dead, however, and I have taken his place," said the other, much delighted. "We are neighbours, so will you be so kind as to come over one day and explain the apocalypse to me?" said Aglaya. "I do not understand it in the least." "Allow me to warn you," interposed General Ivolgin, "that he is the greatest charlatan on earth." He had taken the chair next to the girl, and was impatient to begin talking. "No doubt there are pleasures and amusements peculiar to the country," he continued, "and to listen to a pretended student holding forth on the book of the Revelations may be as good as any other. It may even be original. But you seem to be looking at me with some surprise. May I introduce myself? General Ivolgin. I carried you in my arms as a baby." "Delighted, I'm sure," said Aglaya. "I am acquainted with Varvara Ardalionovna and Nina Alexandrovna." She was trying hard to restrain herself from laughing. Mrs. Epanchin flushed up. Some accumulation of spleen in her suddenly needed an outlet. She could not bear this General Ivolgin, whom she had once known, long ago, in society. "You are deviating from the truth, sir, as usual," she remarked, boiling over with indignation. "You never carried her in your life." "You have forgotten, mother," said Aglaya suddenly. "He really did carry me about. In Tver, you know. I was 6 years old, I remember. He made me a bow and arrow, and I shot a pigeon. Don't you remember shooting a pigeon, you and I, one day? Yes, and he made me a cardboard helmet and a little wooden sword. I remember, said Adelaida. Yes, I remember too, said Alexandra. You quarrelled about the wounded pigeon, and Adelaida was put in the corner and stood there with her helmet and sword and all. The poor general had merely made the remark about having carried Aglaya in his arms because he always did so begin a conversation with young people. But it happened that this time he had really hit upon the truth, though he had himself entirely forgotten the fact. But when Adelaida and Aglaya recalled the episode of the pigeon, his mind became filled with memories, and it is impossible to describe how this poor old man, usually half drunk, was moved by the recollection. I remember it all, he cried. I was captain then. You were such a lovely little thing. Nina Alexandrovna, Gania, listen. I was received then by General Yepanchin. Yes, and look what you have come to now, interrupted Mrs. Yepanchin. However, I see you have not quite drunk your better feelings away. But you have broken your wife's heart, sir, and instead of looking after your children, you have spent your time in public houses and debtors' prisons. Go away, my friend, stand in some corner and weep, and bemoan your fallen dignity, and perhaps God will forgive you yet. Go, go, I'm serious. There's nothing so favourable for repentance as to think of the past with feelings of remorse. There was no need to repeat that she was serious. The general, like all drunkards, was extremely emotional, and easily touched by recollections of his better days. He rose and walked quietly to the door, so meekly that Mrs. Yepanchin was instantly sorry for him. Ardalion Alexandrovitch, she cried after him, wait a moment, we are all sinners. When you feel that your conscience reproaches you a little less, come over to me and we'll have a talk about the past. I dare say I am 50 times more of a sinner than you are. And now go, goodbye. You had better not stay here, she added in alarm as he turned as though to come back. Don't go after him just now, Kolya, or he'll be vexed, and the benefit of this moment will be lost, said the prince, as the boy was hurrying out of the room. Quite true. Much better to go in half an hour or so, said Mrs. Yepanchin. That's what comes of telling the truth for once in one's life, said Lebedev. It reduced him to tears. Come, come, the less you say about it, the better. To judge from all I have heard about you, replied Mrs. Yepanchin. The prince took the first opportunity of informing the Yepanchin ladies that he had intended to pay them a visit that day, if they had not themselves come this afternoon, and Lizaveta Prokofievna replied that she hoped he would still do so. By this time some of the visitors had disappeared. Ptitsin had tactfully retreated to Lebedev's wing, and Gania soon followed him. The latter had behaved modestly, but with dignity, on this occasion of his first meeting with the Yepanchins since the rupture. Twice Mrs. Yepanchin had deliberately examined him from head to foot, but he had stood fire without flinching. He was certainly much changed, as anyone could see who had not met him for some time, and this fact seemed to afford Aglaya a good deal of satisfaction. That was Gavrila Ardalionovitch who just went out, wasn't it? She asked suddenly, interrupting somebody else's conversation to make the remark. Yes, it was, said the prince. I hardly knew him. He is much changed, and for the better." "I am very glad," said the prince. "He has been very ill," added Varia. "How has he changed for the better?" asked Mrs. Epanchin. "I don't see any change for the better. What's better in him? Where did you get that idea from? What's better?" "There's nothing better than the poor knight," said Colia, who was standing near the last speaker's chair. "I quite agree with you there," said Prince S., laughing. "So do I," said Adelaida solemnly. "What poor knight?" asked Mrs. Epanchin, looking round at the face of each of the speakers in turn. Seeing, however, that Aglaya was blushing, she added angrily, "What nonsense you are all talking! What do you mean by poor knight?" "It's not the first time this urchin, your favourite, has shown his impudence by twisting other people's words," said Aglaya haughtily. Every time that Aglaya showed temper, and this was very often, there was so much childish pouting, such schoolgirlishness, as it were, in her apparent wrath, that it was impossible to avoid smiling at her, to her own unutterable indignation. On these occasions she would say, "How can they? How dare they laugh at me?" This time everyone laughed at her. Her sisters, Prince S., Prince Myshkin, though he himself had flushed for some reason, and Colia. Aglaya was dreadfully indignant, and looked twice as pretty in her wrath. "He's always twisting round what one says," she cried. "I am only repeating your own exclamation," said Colia. "A month ago you were turning over the pages of your Don Quixote, and suddenly called out, 'There is nothing better than the poor knight.' I don't know whom you were referring to, of course, whether to Don Quixote, or Evgenie Pavlovitch, or someone else, but you certainly said these words, and afterwards there was a long conversation. You are inclined to go a little too far, my good boy, with your guesses," said Mrs. Epanchin, with some show of annoyance. "But it's not I alone," cried Colia. "They all talked about it, and they do still. Why, just now Prince S. and Adelaida Ivanovna declared that they upheld the poor knight. So evidently there does exist a poor knight, and if it were not for Adelaida Ivanovna, we should have known long ago who the poor knight was." "Why, how am I to blame?" asked Adelaida, smiling. "You wouldn't draw his portrait for us, that's why you are to blame. Aglaya Ivanovna asked you to draw his portrait, and gave you the whole subject of the picture. She invented it herself, and you wouldn't." "What was I to draw? According to the lines she quoted, 'From his face he never lifted that eternal mask of steel.' What sort of a face was I to draw? I couldn't draw a mask." "I don't know what you are driving at. What mask do you mean?" asked Mrs. Epanchin irritably. She began to see pretty clearly, though, what it meant, and whom they referred to by the generally accepted title of Poor Knight. But what specially annoyed her was that the prince was looking so uncomfortable and blushing like a 10-year-old child. "Well, have you finished your silly joke?" she added, "and am I to be told what this poor knight means? Or is it a solemn secret which cannot be approached lightly?" But they all laughed on. "It's simply that there is a Russian poem," began Prince S., evidently anxious to change the conversation. "A strange thing, without beginning or end, and all about a poor knight. A month or so ago we were all talking and laughing, and looking up a subject for one of Adelaida's pictures. You know it is the principal business of this family to find subjects for Adelaida's pictures. Well, we happened upon this poor knight. I don't remember who thought of it first." "Oh, Aglaya Ivanovna did," said Colia. "Very likely, I don't recollect," continued Prince S. "Some of us laughed at the subject, some liked it, but she declared that in order to make a picture of the gentleman she must first see his face. We then began to think over all our friends' faces to see if any of them would do, and none suited us, and so the matter stood, that's all. I don't know why Nikolai Ardalionovitch has brought up the joke now. What was appropriate and funny then has quite lost all interest by this time." "Probably there's some new silliness about it," said Mrs. Epanchin sarcastically. "There is no silliness about it at all, only the profoundest respect," said Aglaya very seriously. She had quite recovered her temper. In fact, from certain signs, it was fair to conclude that she was delighted to see this joke going so far, and a careful observer might have remarked that her satisfaction dated from the moment when the fact of the prince's confusion became apparent to all. "Profoundest respect? What nonsense! First, insane giggling, and then, all of a sudden, a display of profoundest respect. Why respect? Tell me at once, why have you suddenly developed this profound respect, eh?" "Because," replied Aglaya gravely, "in the poem the knight is described as a man capable of living up to an ideal all his life. That sort of thing is not to be found every day among the men of our times. In the poem it is not stated exactly what the ideal was, but it was evidently some vision, some revelation of pure beauty, and the knight wore round his neck, instead of a scarf, a rosary. A device, ANB, the meaning of which is not explained, was inscribed on his shield." "No, AND," corrected Colia. "I say ANB, and so it shall be," cried Aglaya irritably. "Anyway, the poor knight did not care what his lady was, or what she did. He had chosen his ideal, and he was bound to serve her, and break lances for her, and acknowledge her as the ideal of pure beauty, whatever she might say or do afterwards. If she had taken to stealing, he would have championed her just the same. I think the poet desired to embody in this one picture the whole spirit of medieval chivalry and the platonic love of a pure and high-souled knight. Of course, it's all an ideal, and in the poor knight that spirit reached the utmost limit of asceticism. He is a Don Quixote, only serious and not comical. I used not to understand him, and laughed at him, but now I love the poor knight, and respect his actions." So ended Aglaya, and to look at her it was difficult indeed to judge whether she was joking or in earnest. "Pooh! He was a fool, and his actions were the actions of a fool," said Mrs. Epanchin. "And as for you, young woman, you ought to know better. At all events, you are not to talk like that again. What poem is it? Recite it. I want to hear this poem. I have hated poetry all my life. Prince, you must excuse this nonsense. We neither of us like this sort of thing. Be patient." They certainly were put out, both of them. The prince tried to say something, but he was too confused, and could not get his words out. Aglaya, who had taken such liberties in her little speech, was the only person present, perhaps, who was not in the least embarrassed. She seemed, in fact, quite pleased. She now rose solemnly from her seat, walked to the centre of the terrace, and stood in front of the prince's chair. All looked on with some surprise, and Prince S. and her sisters with feelings of decided alarm, to see what new frolic she was up to. It had gone quite far enough already, they thought, but Aglaya evidently thoroughly enjoyed the affectation and ceremony with which she was introducing her recitation of the poem. Mrs. Epanchin was just wondering whether she would not forbid the performance after all, when, at the very moment that Aglaya commenced her declamation, two new guests, both talking loudly, entered from the street. The new arrivals were General Epanchin and a young man. Their entrance caused some slight commotion. End of Part 2, Chapter 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 7 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 7. The young fellow accompanying the general was about 28, tall and well built, with a handsome and clever face, and bright black eyes, full of fun and intelligence. Aglaya did not so much as glance at the new arrivals, but went on with her recitation, gazing at the prince the while in an affected manner, and at him alone. It was clear to him that she was doing all this with some special object. But the new guests at least somewhat eased his strained and uncomfortable position. Seeing them approaching, he rose from his chair, and nodding amicably to the general, signed to him not to interrupt the recitation. He then got behind his chair and stood there with his left hand resting on the back of it. Thanks to this change of position, he was able to listen to the ballad with far less embarrassment than before. Mrs. Epanchin had also twice motioned to the new arrivals to be quiet and stay where they were. The prince was much interested in the young man who had just entered. He easily concluded that this was Yevgeny Pavlovich Radomsky, of whom he had already heard mention several times. He was puzzled, however, by the young man's plain clothes, for he had always heard of Yevgeny Pavlovich as a military man. An ironical smile played on Yevgeny's lips all the while the recitation was proceeding, which showed that he too was probably in the secret of the poor knight joke. But it had become quite a different matter with Aglaya. All the affectation of manner which she had displayed at the beginning disappeared as the ballad proceeded. She spoke the lines in so serious and exalted a manner, and with so much taste, that she even seemed to justify the exaggerated solemnity with which she had stepped forward. It was impossible to discern in her now anything but a deep feeling for the spirit of the poem which she had undertaken to interpret. Her eyes were aglow with inspiration, and a slight tremor of rapture passed over her lovely features once or twice. She continued to recite. Once there came a vision glorious, mystic, dreadful, wondrous fair, burned itself into his spirit, and abode for ever there. Nevermore from that sweet moment gazed he on womankind. He was dumb to love and wooing, and to all their graces blind. full of love for that sweet vision, brave and pure, he took the field. With his blood he stained the letters N.P.B. upon his shield. Lumen Caeli, Sancta Rosa. Shouting on the foe he fell, and like thunder rang his war cry o'er the cowering infidel. Then within his distant castle, home returned, he dreamed his days, silent, sad, and when death took him, he was mad, the legend says. When recalling all this afterwards, the prince could not for the life of him understand how to reconcile the beautiful, sincere, pure nature of the girl with the irony of this jest. That it was a jest there was no doubt whatever. He knew that well enough, and had good reason too for his conviction, for during her recitation of the ballad, Aglaya had deliberately changed the letters A-N-B into N-P-B. He was quite sure she had not done this by accident, and that his ears had not deceived him. At all events, her performance, which was a joke, of course, if rather a crude one, was premeditated. They had evidently talked and laughed over the poor knight for more than a month. Yet Aglaya had brought out these letters N.P.B. not only without the slightest appearance of irony, or even any particular accentuation, but with so even and unbroken an appearance of seriousness that assuredly anyone might have supposed that these initials were the original ones written in the ballad. The thing made an uncomfortable impression upon the prince. Of course Mrs. Epanchin saw nothing either in the change of initials or in the insinuation embodied therein. General Epanchin only knew that there was a recitation of verses going on, and took no further interest in the matter. Of the rest of the audience, many had understood the allusion, and wondered both at the daring of the lady and at the motive underlying it, but tried to show no sign of their feelings. But Evgenie Pavlovitch, as the prince was ready to wager, both comprehended and tried his best to show that he comprehended. His smile was too mocking to leave any doubt on that point. "How beautiful that is!" cried Mrs. Epanchin, with sincere admiration. "Whose is it?" "Pushkin's, mamma, of course. Don't disgrace us all by showing your ignorance," said Adelaida. "As soon as we reach home, give it to me to read." "I don't think we have a copy of Pushkin in the house." "There are a couple of torn volumes somewhere. They have been lying about from time immemorial," added Alexandra. "Send Fyodor or Alexei up by the very first train to buy a copy, then. Aglaya, come here. Kiss me, dear. You recited beautifully. But," she added in a whisper, "if you were sincere, I am sorry for you. If it was a joke, I do not approve of the feelings which prompted you to do it, and in any case you would have done far better not to recite it at all. Do you understand? Now come along, young woman, we've sat here too long. I'll speak to you about this another time." Meanwhile the prince took the opportunity of greeting General Epanchin, and the general introduced Evgenie Pavlovitch to him. "I called him up on the way to your house," explained the general. "He had heard that we were all here." "Yes, and I heard that you were here too," added Evgenie Pavlovitch, "and since I had long promised myself the pleasure of seeking not only your acquaintance, but your friendship, I did not wish to waste time, but came straight on. I am sorry to hear that you are unwell." "Oh, but I'm quite well now, thank you, and very glad to make your acquaintance. Prince S. has often spoken to me about you," said Myshkin, and for an instant the two men looked intently into one another's eyes. The prince remarked that Evgenie Pavlovitch's plain clothes had evidently made a great impression upon the company present, so much so that all other interests seemed to be effaced before this surprising fact. His change of dress was evidently a matter of some importance. Adelaida and Alexandra poured out a stream of questions. Prince S., a relative of the young man, appeared annoyed, and Ivan Fyodorovitch quite excited. Aglaya alone was not interested. She merely looked closely at Evgenie for a minute, curious perhaps as to whether civil or military clothes became him best, then turned away and paid no more attention to him or his costume. Lizaveta Prokofievna asked no questions, but it was clear that she was uneasy, and the prince fancied that Evgenie was not in her good graces. "He has astonished me," said Ivan Fyodorovitch. "I nearly fell down with surprise. I could hardly believe my eyes when I met him in Petersburg just now. Why this haste? That's what I want to know. He has always said himself that there is no need to break windows." Evgenie Pavlovitch remarked here that he had spoken of his intention of leaving the service long ago. He had, however, always made more or less of a joke about it, so no one had taken him seriously. For that matter, he joked about everything, and his friends never knew what to believe, especially if he did not wish them to understand him. "I have only retired for a time," said he, laughing, "for a few months, at most for a year." "But there is no necessity for you to retire at all," complained the general, "as far as I know." "I want to go and look after my country estates. You advised me to do that yourself," was the reply, "and then I wish to go abroad." After a few more expostulations, the conversation drifted into other channels, but the prince, who had been an attentive listener, thought all this excitement about so small a matter very curious. There must be more in it than appears, he said to himself. "I see the poor knight has come on the scene again," said Evgenie Pavlovitch, stepping to Aglaya's side. To the amazement of the prince, who overheard the remark, Aglaya looked haughtily and inquiringly at the questioner, as though she would give him to know, once for all, that there could be no talk between them about the poor knight, and that she did not understand his question. "But not now. It is too late to send to town for a Pushkin now. It is much too late, I say," Kolya was exclaiming in a loud voice. "I have told you so at least 100 times." "Yes, it is really much too late to send to town now," said Evgenie Pavlovitch, who had escaped from Aglaya as rapidly as possible. "I am sure the shops are shut in Petersburg. It is past 8 o'clock," he added, looking at his watch. "We have done without him so far," interrupted Adelaida in her turn. "Surely we can wait until tomorrow." "Besides," said Kolya, "it is quite unusual, almost improper for people in our position to take any interest in literature. Ask Evgenie Pavlovitch if I'm not right. It is much more fashionable to drive a wagonette with red wheels." "You got that from some magazine, Kolya," remarked Adelaida. "He gets most of his conversation in that way," laughed Evgenie Pavlovitch. "He borrows whole phrases from the reviews. I have long had the pleasure of knowing both Nikolai Ardalionovitch and his conversational methods, but this time he was not repeating something he had read. He was alluding, no doubt, to my yellow wagonette, which has, or had, red wheels. But I have exchanged it, so you are rather behind the times, Kolya." The prince had been listening attentively to Radomski's words, and thought his manner very pleasant. When Kolya chaffed him about his wagonette, he had replied with perfect equality and in a friendly fashion. This pleased Myshkin. At this moment, Vera came up to Lizaveta Prokofyevna, carrying several large and beautifully bound books, apparently quite new. "What is it?" demanded the lady. "This is Pushkin," replied the girl. "Papa told me to offer it to you." "What? Impossible!" exclaimed Mrs. Epanchin. "Not as a present? Not as a present I should not have taken the liberty," said Lebedeff, appearing suddenly from behind his daughter. "It is our own Pushkin, our family copy, Annenkoff's edition. It could not be bought now. I beg to suggest, with great respect, that your Excellency should buy it, and thus quench the noble literary thirst which is consuming you at this moment," he concluded grandiloquently. "Oh, if you will sell it, very good, and thank you. You shall not be a loser. But for goodness sake, don't twist about like that, sir. I have heard of you. They tell me you are a very learned person. We must have a talk one of these days. You will bring me the books yourself?" "With the greatest respect and veneration," replied Lebedeff, making extraordinary grimaces. "Well, bring them, with or without respect, provided always you do not drop them on the way. But on the condition," went on the lady, looking full at him, "that you do not cross my threshold. I do not intend to receive you today. You may send your daughter Vera at once, if you like. I am much pleased with her." "Why don't you tell him about them?" said Vera impatiently to her father. "They will come in, whether you announce them or not, and they are beginning to make a row. Lef Nikolayevich," she addressed herself to the prince, "4 men are here asking for you. They have waited some time, and are beginning to make a fuss, and papa will not bring them in." "Who are these people?" said the prince. "They say they have come on business, and they are the kind of men who, if you do not see them here, will follow you about the street. It would be better to receive them, and then you will get rid of them. Gavrila Ardalionovitch and Ptitsin are both there, trying to make them hear reason." "Pavlicheff's son! It is not worth while," cried Lebedeff. "There is no necessity to see them, and it would be most unpleasant for your Excellency. They do not deserve—" "What? Pavlicheff's son?" cried the prince, much perturbed. I know, but I entrusted this matter to Gavrila Ardalionovitch. He told me—" At that moment Gania, accompanied by Ptitsin, came out to the terrace. From an adjoining room came a noise of angry voices, and General Ivolgin, in loud tones, seemed to be trying to shout them down. Kolya rushed off at once to investigate the cause of the uproar. "This is most interesting," observed Evgenie Pavlovitch. "I expect he knows all about it," thought the prince. "What, the son of Pavlicheff? And who may this son of Pavlicheff be?" asked General Epanchin with surprise, and looking curiously around him, he discovered that he alone had no clue to the mystery. Expectation and suspense were on every face, with the exception of that of the prince, who stood gravely wondering how an affair so entirely personal could have awakened such lively and widespread interest in so short a time. Aglaya went up to him with a peculiarly serious look. "It will be well," she said, "if you put an end to this affair yourself at once. But you must allow us to be your witnesses. They want to throw mud at you, Prince, and you must be triumphantly vindicated. I give you joy beforehand." "And I also wish for justice to be done once for all," cried Madame Epanchin, "about this impudent claim. Deal with them promptly, Prince, and don't spare them. I am sick of hearing about the affair, and many a quarrel I have had in your cause. But I confess I am anxious to see what happens, so do make them come out here, and we will remain. You have heard people talking about it, no doubt," she added, turning to Prince S. "Of course," said he, "I have heard it spoken about at your house, and I am anxious to see these young men." "They are nihilists, are they not?" "No, they are not nihilists," explained Lebedeff, who seemed much excited. "This is another lot, a special group. According to my nephew, they are more advanced even than the nihilists. You are quite wrong, Excellency, if you think that your presence will intimidate them. Nothing intimidates them. Educated men, learned men even, are to be found among nihilists. These go further, in that they are men of action. The movement is, properly speaking, a derivative from nihilism, though they are only known indirectly and by hearsay, for they never advertise their doings in the papers. They go straight to the point. For them it is not a question of showing that Pushkin is stupid, or that Russia must be torn in pieces. No, but if they have a great desire for anything, they believe they have a right to get it, even at the cost of the lives, say, of 8 persons. They are checked by no obstacles. In fact, Prince, I should not advise you—" But Myshkin had risen and was on his way to open the door for his visitors. "You are slandering them, Lebedeff," said he, smiling. "You are always thinking about your nephew's conduct. Don't believe him, Lizaveta Prokofyevna. I can assure you Gorsky and Danilov are exceptions, and that these are only mistaken. However, I do not care about receiving them here, in public. Excuse me, Lizaveta Prokofyevna. They are coming, and you can see them, and then I will take them away. Please come in, gentlemen." Another thought tormented him. He wondered, was this an arranged business, arranged to happen when he had guests in his house, and in anticipation of his humiliation rather than of his triumph. But he reproached himself bitterly for such a thought, and felt as if he should die of shame if it were discovered. When his new visitors appeared, he was quite ready to believe himself infinitely less to be respected than any of them. 4 persons entered, led by General Ivolgin, in a state of great excitement and talking eloquently. "He is for me, undoubtedly," thought the prince with a smile. Colia had also joined the party, and was talking with animation to Hippolyte, who listened with a jeering smile on his lips. The prince begged the visitors to sit down. They were all so young that it made the proceedings seem even more extraordinary. Ivan Fyodorovitch, who really understood nothing of what was going on, felt indignant at the sight of these youths, and would have interfered in some way had it not been for the extreme interest shown by his wife in the affair. He therefore remained, partly through curiosity, partly through good nature, hoping that his presence might be of some use. But the bow with which General Ivolgin greeted him irritated him anew. He frowned and decided to be absolutely silent. As to the rest, one was a man of 30, a retired officer, now a boxer, who had been with Rogozhin, and in his happier days had given 15 roubles at a time to beggars. Evidently he had joined the others as a comrade to give them moral and, if necessary, material support. The man who had been spoken of as Pavlicheff's son, although he gave the name of Antip Burdovsky, was about 22 years of age, fair, thin, and rather tall. He was remarkable for the poverty, not to say uncleanliness, of his personal appearance. The sleeves of his overcoat were greasy, his dirty waistcoat, buttoned up to his neck, showed not a trace of linen. A filthy black silk scarf, twisted till it resembled a cord, was round his neck, and his hands were unwashed. He looked round with an air of insolent effrontery. His face, covered with pimples, was neither thoughtful nor even contemptuous. It wore an expression of complacent satisfaction in demanding his rights and in being an aggrieved party. His voice trembled, and he spoke so fast and with such stammerings that he might have been taken for a foreigner, though the purest Russian blood ran in his veins. Lebedeff's nephew, whom the reader has seen already, accompanied him, and also the youth named Hippolyte Terentieff. The latter was only 17 or 18. He had an intelligent face, though it was usually irritated and fretful in expression. His skeleton-like figure, his ghastly complexion, the brightness of his eyes, and the red spots of colour on his cheek betrayed the victim of consumption to the most casual glance. He coughed persistently and panted for breath. It looked as though he had but a few weeks more to live. He was nearly dead with fatigue, and fell rather than sat into a chair. The rest bowed as they came in, and being more or less abashed, put on an air of extreme self-assurance. In short, their attitude was not that which one would have expected in men who professed to despise all trivialities, all foolish, mundane conventions, and indeed everything, except their own personal interests. Antip Burdovsky, stuttered the son of Pavlicheff. Vladimir Doktorenko, said Lebedeff's nephew briskly, and with a certain pride, as if he boasted of his name. Keller, murmured the retired officer. Hippolyte Terentieff, cried the last named in a shrill voice. They sat now in a row facing the prince, and frowned, and played with their caps. All appeared ready to speak, and yet all were silent. The defiant expression on their faces seemed to say, "No, sir, you don't take us in." It could be felt that the first words spoken by anyone present would bring a torrent of speech from the whole deputation. End of Part 2, Chapter 7. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 8 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 8. I did not expect you, gentlemen, began the prince, I have been ill until today. A month ago," he continued, addressing himself to Antip Burdovsky, "I put your business into Gavrila Ardalionovitch Ivolgin's hands, as I told you then. I do not in the least object to having a personal interview, but you will agree with me that this is hardly the time. I propose that we go into another room, if you will not keep me long. As you see, I have friends here, and believe me—" "Friends as many as you please, but allow me," interrupted the harsh voice of Lebedeff's nephew, "allow me to tell you that you might have treated us rather more politely, and not have kept us waiting at least 2 hours. No doubt, and is that acting like a prince? And you may be a general, but I am not your valet, and I stammered Antip Burdovsky. He was extremely excited, his lips trembled, and the resentment of an embittered soul was in his voice. But he spoke so indistinctly that hardly a dozen words could be gathered. "It was a princely action," sneered Hippolyte. "If anyone had treated me so," grumbled the boxer, "I mean to say that if I'd been in Burdovsky's place, Gentlemen, I did not know you were there. I have only just been informed, I assure you," repeated Myshkin.
"We are not afraid of your friends, Prince," remarked Lebedeff's nephew, "for we are within our rights."
The shrill tones of Hippolyte interrupted him.
"What right have you? By what right do you demand us to submit this matter about Burdovsky to the judgment of your friends? We know only too well what the judgment of your friends will be."
This beginning gave promise of a stormy discussion. The prince was discouraged, but at last he managed to make himself heard amid the vociferations of his excited visitors. "If you," he said, addressing Burdovsky, "if you prefer not to speak here, I offer again to go into another room with you. And as to your waiting to see me, I repeat that I only this instant heard—"
"Well, you have no right. You have no right at all. Your friends, indeed," gabbled Burdovsky, defiantly examining the faces round him, and becoming more and more excited. "You have no right."
As he ended thus abruptly, he leant forward, staring at the prince with his short-sighted, bloodshot eyes. The latter was so astonished that he did not reply, but looked steadily at him in return.
"Lef Nikolayevich,"
interposed Madame Epanchin suddenly,
"read this at once, this very moment. It is about this business."
She held out a weekly comic paper, pointing to an article on one of its pages. Just as the visitors were coming in, Lebedeff, wishing to ingratiate himself with the great lady, had pulled this paper from his pocket and presented it to her, indicating a few columns marked in pencil. Lizaveta Prokofievna had had time to read some of it, and was greatly upset. "Would it not be better to peruse it alone, later?" asked the prince nervously.
No, read it. Read it at once, directly, and aloud,
cried she, calling Colia to her and giving him the journal.
"Read it aloud so that everyone may hear it."
An impetuous woman, Lizaveta Prokofievna sometimes weighed her anchors and put out to sea, quite regardless of the possible storms she might encounter. Ivan Fyodorovitch felt a sudden pang of alarm, but the others were merely curious and somewhat surprised. Colia unfolded the paper and began to read, in his clear, high-pitched voice, the following article.
"Proletarians and scions of nobility. An episode of the brigandage of today and every day. Progress, reform, justice. Strange things are going on in our so-called Holy Russia in this age of reform and great enterprises, this age of patriotism in which hundreds of millions are yearly sent abroad, in which industry is encouraged and the hands of labour paralysed, etc. There is no end to this, gentlemen, so let us come to the point. A strange thing has happened to a scion of our defunct aristocracy, de profundis. The grandfathers of these scions ruined themselves at the gaming tables. Their fathers were forced to serve as officers or subalterns. Some have died just as they were about to be tried for innocent thoughtlessness in the handling of public funds. Their children are sometimes congenital idiots, like the hero of our story. Sometimes they are found in the dock at the assizes, where they are generally acquitted by the jury for edifying motives. Sometimes they distinguish themselves by one of those burning scandals that amaze the public, and add another blot to the stained record of our age. 6 months ago, that is last winter, this particular scion returned to Russia, wearing gaiters like a foreigner, and shivering with cold in an old scantily lined cloak. He had come from Switzerland, where he had just undergone a successful course of treatment for idiocy. Sick. Certainly fortune favoured him, for apart from the interesting malady of which he was cured in Switzerland, can there be a cure for idiocy? His story proves the truth of the Russian proverb that happiness is the right of certain classes. Judge for yourselves. Our subject was an infant in arms when he lost his father, an officer who died just as he was about to be court-martialed for gambling away the funds of his company, and perhaps also for flogging a subordinate to excess. Remember the good old days, gentlemen. The orphan was brought up by the charity of a very rich Russian landowner. In the good old days, this man, whom we will call P, owned 4,000 souls as serfs. Souls as serfs! Can you understand such an expression, gentlemen? I cannot. It must be looked up in a dictionary before one can understand it. These things of a bygone day are already unintelligible to us. He appears to have been one of those Russian parasites who lead an idle existence abroad, spending the summer at some spa and the winter in Paris, to the greater profit of the organisers of public balls. It may safely be said that the manager of the Château des Fleurs, lucky man, pocketed at least a third of the money paid by Russian peasants to their lords in the days of serfdom. However this may be, the gay P brought up the orphan like a prince, provided him with tutors and governesses, pretty of course, which he chose himself in Paris. But the little aristocrat, the last of his noble race, was an idiot. The governesses, recruited at the Château des Fleurs, laboured in vain. At 20 years of age, their pupil could not speak in any language, not even Russian. But ignorance of the latter was still excusable. At last, P was seized with a strange notion. He imagined that in Switzerland they could change an idiot into a man of sense. After all, the idea was quite logical. A parasite and landowner naturally supposed that intelligence was a marketable commodity, like everything else, and that in Switzerland especially it could be bought for money. The case was entrusted to a celebrated Swiss professor, and cost thousands of roubles. The treatment lasted 5 years. Needless to say, the idiot did not become more intelligent, but it is alleged that he grew into something more or less resembling a man. At this stage, P died suddenly, and as usual he had made no will and left his affairs in disorder. A crowd of eager claimants arose, who cared nothing about any last scion of a noble race undergoing treatment in Switzerland at the expense of the deceased as a congenital idiot. Idiot though he was, the noble scion tried to cheat his professor, and they say he succeeded in getting him to continue the treatment gratis for 2 years by concealing the death of his benefactor. But the professor himself was a charlatan. Getting anxious at last when no money was forthcoming, and alarmed above all by his patient's appetite, he presented him with a pair of old gaiters and a shabby cloak, and packed him off to Russia, 3rd class. It would seem that fortune had turned her back upon our hero. Not at all. Fortune, who lets whole populations die of hunger, showered all her gifts at once upon the little aristocrat, like Krylov's cloud, which passes over an arid plain and empties itself into the sea. He had scarcely arrived in St. Petersburg when a relation of his mother's, who was of bourgeois origin of course, died at Moscow. He was a merchant, an old believer, and he had no children. He left a fortune of several millions in good current coin, and everything came to our noble scion, our gaitered baron, formerly treated for idiocy in a Swiss lunatic asylum. Instantly the scene changed. Crowds of friends gathered round our baron, who meanwhile had lost his head over a celebrated demi-mondaine. He even discovered some relations. Moreover, a number of young girls of high birth burned to be united to him in lawful matrimony. Could anyone possibly imagine a better match? Aristocrat, millionaire, and idiot. He has every advantage. One might hunt in vain for his equal, even with the lantern of Diogenes. His like is not to be had even by getting it made to order.
"Ugh, I don't know what this means," cried Ivan Fyodorovitch, transported with indignation.
"Leave off, Kolya," begged the prince.
Exclamations arose on all sides.
"Let him go on reading at all costs,"
ordered Lizaveta Prokofievna, evidently preserving her composure by a desperate effort.
"Prince, if the reading is stopped, you and I will quarrel."
Kolya had no choice but to obey. With crimson cheeks he read on unsteadily.
"But while our young millionaire dwelt, as it were, in the Empyrean, something new occurred. One fine morning a man called upon him, calm and severe of aspect, distinguished but plainly dressed. Politely, but in dignified terms, as befitted his errand, he briefly explained the motive for his visit. He was a lawyer of enlightened views. His client was a young man who had consulted him in confidence. This young man was no other than the son of P, though he bears another name. In his youth, P, the sensualist, had seduced a young girl, poor but respectable. She was a serf, but had received a European education. Finding that a child was expected, he hastened her marriage with a man of noble character who had loved her for a long time. He helped the young couple for a time, but he was soon obliged to give up, for the high-minded husband refused to accept anything from him. Soon the careless nobleman forgot all about his former mistress and the child she had borne him. Then, as we know, he died intestate. P.'s son, born after his mother's marriage, found a true father in the generous man whose name he bore. But when he also died, the orphan was left to provide for himself, his mother now being an invalid who had lost the use of her limbs. Leaving her in a distant province, he came to the capital in search of pupils. By dint of daily toil, he earned enough to enable him to follow the college courses, and at last to enter the university. But what can one earn by teaching the children of Russian merchants at 10 kopecks a lesson, especially with an invalid mother to keep? Even her death did not much diminish the hardships of the young man's struggle for existence. Now, this is the question. How, in the name of justice, should our scion have argued the case? Our readers will think, no doubt, that he would say to himself, P showered benefits upon me all my life. He spent tens of thousands of roubles to educate me, to provide me with governesses, and to keep me under treatment in Switzerland. Now I am a millionaire, and P.'s son, a noble young man who is not responsible for the faults of his careless and forgetful father, is wearing himself out giving ill-paid lessons. According to justice, all that was done for me ought to have been done for him. The enormous sums spent upon me were not really mine. They came to me by an error of blind fortune, when they ought to have gone to P.'s son. They should have gone to benefit him, not me, in whom P. interested himself by a mere caprice, instead of doing his duty as a father. If I wished to behave nobly, justly, and with delicacy, I ought to bestow half my fortune upon the son of my benefactor. But as economy is my favourite virtue, and I know this is not a case in which the law can intervene, I will not give up half my millions. But it would be too openly vile, too flagrantly infamous, if I did not at least restore to P.'s son the tens of thousands of roubles spent in curing my idiocy. This is simply a case of conscience and of strict justice. Whatever would have become of me if P. had not looked after my education, and had taken care of his own son instead of me? No, gentlemen, our scions of the nobility do not reason thus. The lawyer, who had taken up the matter purely out of friendship to the young man, and almost against his will, invoked every consideration of justice, delicacy, honour, and even plain figures. In vain. The ex-patient of the Swiss lunatic asylum was inflexible. All this might pass, but the sequel is absolutely unpardonable, and not to be excused by any interesting malady. This millionaire, having but just discarded the old gaiters of the professor, could not even understand that the young man slaving away at his lessons was not asking for charitable help, but for his rightful due, though the debt was not a legal one; that, correctly speaking, he was not asking for anything, but it was merely his friends who had thought fit to bestir themselves on his behalf. With the cool insolence of a bloated capitalist secure in his millions, he majestically drew a banknote for 50 roubles from his pocket-book and sent it to the noble young man as a humiliating piece of charity. You can hardly believe it, gentlemen. You are scandalized and disgusted. You cry out in indignation. But this is what he did. Needless to say, the money was returned, or rather flung back in his face. The case is not within the province of the law. It must be referred to the tribunal of public opinion. This is what we now do, guaranteeing the truth of all the details which we have related." When Colia had finished reading, he handed the paper to the prince, and retired silently to a corner of the room, hiding his face in his hands. He was overcome by a feeling of inexpressible shame. His boyish sensitiveness was wounded beyond endurance. It seemed to him that something extraordinary, some sudden catastrophe had occurred, and that he was almost the cause of it, because he had read the article aloud. Yet all the others were similarly affected. The girls were uncomfortable and ashamed. Lizaveta Prokofievna restrained her violent anger by a great effort. Perhaps she bitterly regretted her interference in the matter. For the present she kept silence. The prince felt as very shy people often do in such a case. He was so ashamed of the conduct of other people, so humiliated for his guests, that he dared not look them in the face. Ptitsin, Varia, Gania, and Lebedev himself all looked rather confused. Stranger still, Hippolyte and the son of Pavlichev also seemed slightly surprised, and Lebedeff's nephew was obviously far from pleased. The boxer alone was perfectly calm. He twisted his moustaches with affected dignity, and if his eyes were cast down, it was certainly not in confusion, but rather in noble modesty, as if he did not wish to be insolent in his triumph. It was evident that he was delighted with the article. "The devil knows what it means," growled Ivan Fyodorovitch under his breath. "It must have taken the united wits of 50 footmen to write it." "May I ask your reason for such an insulting supposition, sir?"
said Hippolyte, trembling with rage.
"You will admit yourself, General, that for an honourable man, if the author is an honourable man, that is an insult," growled the boxer suddenly, with convulsive jerkings of his shoulders. "In the first place, it is not for you to address me as sir, and in the second place, I refuse to give you any explanation," said Ivan Fyodorovitch vehemently. And he rose without another word, and went and stood on the first step of the flight that led from the veranda to the street, turning his back on the company. He was indignant with Lizaveta Prokofievna, who did not think of moving even now. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, let me speak at last," cried the prince, anxious and agitated. "Please let us understand one another. I say nothing about the article, gentlemen, except that every word is false. I say this because you know it as well as I do. It is shameful. I should be surprised if any one of you could have written it."
"I did not know of its existence till this moment," declared Hippolyte. "I do not approve of it."
"I knew it had been written, but I would not have advised its publication," said Lebedeff's nephew, "because it is premature." "I knew it, but I have a right. I stammered the son of Pavlichev.
"What? Did you write all that yourself? Is it possible?" asked the prince, regarding Burdovsky with curiosity.
"One might dispute your right to ask such questions," observed Lebedeff's nephew.
"I was only surprised that Mr. Burdovsky should have... However, this is what I have to say. Since you had already given the matter publicity, why did you object just now, when I began to speak of it to my friends?"
"At last!"
murmured Lizaveta Prokofievna indignantly. Lebedeff could restrain himself no longer. He made his way through the row of chairs. "Prince," he cried,
You are forgetting that if you consented to receive and hear them, it was only because of your kind heart, which has no equal, for they had not the least right to demand it, especially as you had placed the matter in the hands of Gavrila Ardalionovitch, which was also extremely kind of you. You are also forgetting, most excellent prince, that you are with friends, a select company. You cannot sacrifice them to these gentlemen, and it is only for you to have them turned out this instant. As the master of the house, I shall have great pleasure."
"Quite right,"
agreed General Ivolgin in a loud voice. "That will do, Lebedeff, that will do," began the prince, when an indignant outcry drowned his words.
"Excuse me, prince, excuse me, but that will not do," shouted Lebedeff's nephew, his voice dominating all the others. "The matter must be clearly stated, for it is obviously not properly understood. They are calling in some legal chicanery, and upon that ground they are threatening to turn us out of the house. Really, prince, do you think we are such fools as not to be aware that this matter does not come within the law, and that legally we cannot claim a rouble from you? But we are also aware that if actual law is not on our side, human law is for us, natural law, the law of common sense and conscience, which is no less binding upon every noble and honest man, that is, every man of sane judgment, because it is not to be found in miserable legal codes. If we come here without fear of being turned out, as was threatened just now, because of the imperative tone of our demand, and the unseemliness of such a visit at this late hour, though it was not late when we arrived, we were kept waiting in your anteroom. If, I say, we came in without fear, it is just because we expected to find you a man of sense. I mean, a man of honour and conscience. It is quite true that we did not present ourselves humbly, like your flatterers and parasites, but holding up our heads as befits independent men. We present no petition, but a proud and free demand. Note it well, we do not beseech, we demand. We ask you fairly and squarely in a dignified manner. Do you believe that in this affair of Burdovsky you have right on your side? Do you admit that Pavlichev overwhelmed you with benefits and perhaps saved your life? If you admit it, which we take for granted, do you intend, now that you are a millionaire, and do you not think it in conformity with justice, to indemnify Burdovsky? Yes or no? If it is yes, or in other words, if you possess what you call honour and conscience, and we more justly call common sense, then accede to our demand, and the matter is at an end. Give us satisfaction, without entreaties or thanks from us. Do not expect thanks from us, for what you do will be done not for our sake, but for the sake of justice. If you refuse to satisfy us, that is, if your answer is no, we will go away at once. There will be an end of the matter. But we will tell you to your face before the present company that you are a man of vulgar and undeveloped mind. We will openly deny you the right to speak in future of your honour and conscience, for you have not paid the fair price of such a right. I have no more to say. I put the question before you. Now, turn us out if you dare. You can do it. Force is on your side. But remember that we do not beseech, we demand. We do not beseech, we demand. With these last excited words, Lebedeff's nephew was silent. We demand, we demand, we demand, we do not beseech, spluttered Burdovsky, red as a lobster. The speech of Lebedeff's nephew caused a certain stir among the company. Murmurs arose, though with the exception of Lebedeff, who was still very much excited, everyone was careful not to interfere in the matter. Strangely enough, Lebedeff, although on the prince's side, seemed quite proud of his nephew's eloquence. Gratified vanity was visible in the glances he cast upon the assembled company. "In my opinion, Mr. Doktorenko," said the prince in rather a low voice, "you are quite right in at least half of what you say. I would go further and say that you are altogether right, and that I quite agree with you, if there were not something lacking in your speech. I cannot undertake to say precisely what it is, but you have certainly omitted something, and you cannot be quite just while there is something lacking. But let us put that aside and return to the point. Tell me what induced you to publish this article. Every word of it is a calumny, and I think, gentlemen, that you have been guilty of a mean action." "Allow me!"
"Sir!"
What?" cried all the visitors at once, in violent agitation.
"As to the article," said Hippolyte in his croaking voice, "I have told you already that we none of us approve of it. There is the writer," he added, pointing to the boxer who sat beside him. "I quite admit that he has written it in his old regimental manner, with an equal disregard for style and decency. I know he is a cross between a fool and an adventurer. I make no bones about telling him so to his face every day. But after all, he is half justified. Publicity is the lawful right of every man. Consequently, Burdovsky is not excepted. Let him answer for his own blunders. As to the objection which I made just now, in the name of all, to the presence of your friends, I think I ought to explain, gentlemen, that I only did so to assert our rights, though we really wished to have witnesses. We had agreed unanimously upon the point before we came in. We do not care who your witnesses may be, or whether they are your friends or not, as they cannot fail to recognize Burdovsky's right, seeing that it is mathematically demonstrable. It is just as well that the witnesses should be your friends. The truth will only be more plainly evident."
"It is quite true, we had agreed upon that point," said Lebedeff's nephew in confirmation. "If that is the case, why do you begin by making such a fuss about it?" asked the astonished prince. The boxer was dying to get in a few words. Owing, no doubt, to the presence of the ladies, he was becoming quite jovial. "As to the article, Prince," he said, "I admit that I wrote it, in spite of the severe criticism of my poor friend, in whom I always overlook many things because of his unfortunate state of health. But I wrote and published it in the form of a letter, in the paper of a friend. I showed it to no one but Burdovsky, and I did not read it all through, even to him. He immediately gave me permission to publish it, but you will admit that I might have done so without his consent. Publicity is a noble, beneficent, and universal right. I hope, Prince, that you are too progressive to deny this." "I deny nothing, but you must confess that your article—" "Is a bit thick, you mean? Well, in a way, that is in the public interest. You will admit that yourself, and after all, one cannot overlook a blatant fact. So much the worse for the guilty parties, but the public welfare must come before everything. As to certain inaccuracies and figures of speech, so to speak, you will also admit that the motive, aim, and intention are the chief thing. It is a question, above all, of making a wholesome example. The individual case can be examined afterwards, and as to the style, well, the thing was meant to be humorous, so to speak, and after all, everybody writes like that. You must admit it yourself. "But, gentlemen, I assure you that you are quite astray," exclaimed the prince. "You have published this article upon the supposition that I would never consent to satisfy Mr. Burdovsky. Acting on that conviction, you have tried to intimidate me by this publication, and to be revenged for my supposed refusal.
But what did you know of my intentions? It may be that I have resolved to satisfy Mr. Burdovsky's claim. I now declare openly, in the presence of these witnesses, that I will do so." "The noble and intelligent word of an intelligent and most noble man, at last!" exclaimed the boxer. "Good God!" exclaimed Lizaveta Prokofyevna involuntarily. "This is intolerable!" growled the general. "Allow me, gentlemen, allow me," urged the prince. "I will explain matters to you. 5 weeks ago I received a visit from Tchebarov, your agent, Mr. Burdovsky. You have given a very flattering description of him in your article, Mr. Keller," he continued, turning to the boxer with a smile. "But he did not please me at all. I saw at once that Tchebarov was the moving spirit in the matter, and to speak frankly, I thought he might have induced you, Mr. Burdovsky, to make this claim by taking advantage of your simplicity." "You have no right. I am not simple," stammered Burdovsky, much agitated. "You have no sort of right to suppose such things," said Lebedeff's nephew in a tone of authority. "It is most offensive!" shrieked Hippolyte. "It is an insulting suggestion, false and most ill-timed." "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, please excuse me," said the prince. "I thought absolute frankness on both sides would be best, but have it your own way. I told Tchebarov that as I was not in Petersburg, I would commission a friend to look into the matter without delay, and that I would let you know, Mr. Burdovsky. Gentlemen, I have no hesitation in telling you that it was the fact of Tchebarov's intervention that made me suspect a fraud. Oh, do not take offence at my words, gentlemen. For heaven's sake, do not be so touchy," cried the prince, seeing that Burdovsky was getting excited again, and that the rest were preparing to protest. "If I say I suspected a fraud, there is nothing personal in that. I had never seen any of you then. I did not even know your names. I only judged by Tchebarov. I am speaking quite generally. If you only knew how I have been done since I came into my fortune." "You are shockingly naive, prince," said Lebedeff's nephew in mocking tones. "Besides, though you are a prince and a millionaire, and even though you may really be simple and good-hearted, you can hardly be outside the general law," Hippolyte declared loudly. "Perhaps not. It is very possible," the prince agreed hastily, "though I do not know what general law you allude to. I will go on, only please do not take offence without good cause. I assure you I do not mean to offend you in the least. Really, it is impossible to speak 3 words sincerely without your flying into a rage. At first, I was amazed when Tchebarov told me that Pavlicheff had a son, and that he was in such a miserable position. Pavlicheff was my benefactor, and my father's friend. Oh, Mr. Keller, why does your article impute things to my father without the slightest foundation? He never squandered the funds of his company, nor ill-treated his subordinates. I am absolutely certain of it. I cannot imagine how you could bring yourself to write such a calumny. But your assertions concerning Pavlicheff are absolutely intolerable. You do not scruple to make a libertine of that noble man. You call him a sensualist as coolly as if you were speaking the truth, and yet it would not be possible to find a chaster man. He was even a scholar of note, and in correspondence with several celebrated scientists, and spent large sums in the interests of science. As to his kind heart and his good actions, you were right indeed when you said that I was almost an idiot at that time.
and could hardly understand anything. I could speak and understand Russian, though. But now I can appreciate what I remember." "Excuse me," interrupted Hippolyte. "Is not this rather sentimental? You said you wished to come to the point. Please remember that it is after 9 o'clock." "Very well, gentlemen, very well," replied the prince. "At first I received the news with mistrust. Then I said to myself that I might be mistaken, and that Pavlicheff might possibly have had a son. But I was absolutely amazed at the readiness with which the son had revealed the secret of his birth at the expense of his mother's honour. For Tchebaroff had already menaced me with publicity in our interview." "What nonsense!" Lebedeff's nephew interrupted violently. "You have no right! You have no right!" cried Burdovsky. "The son is not responsible for the misdeeds of his father, and the mother is not to blame," added Hippolyte with warmth. "That seems to me all the more reason for sparing her," said the prince timidly. "Prince, you are not only simple, but your simplicity is almost past the limit," said Lebedeff's nephew with a sarcastic smile. "But what right had you?" said Hippolyte in a very strange tone. "None, none whatever," agreed the prince hastily. "I admit you are right there, but it was involuntary, and I immediately said to myself that my personal feelings had nothing to do with it, that if I thought it right to satisfy the demands of Mr. Burdovsky, out of respect for the memory of Pavlicheff, I ought to do so in any case, whether I esteemed Mr. Burdovsky or not. I only mentioned this, gentlemen, because it seemed so unnatural to me for a son to betray his mother's secret in such a way. In short, that is what convinced me that Tchebaroff must be a rogue, and that he had induced Mr. Burdovsky to attempt this fraud." "But this is intolerable!" cried the visitors, some of them starting to their feet. "Gentlemen, I supposed from this that poor Mr. Burdovsky must be a simple-minded man, quite defenceless, and an easy tool in the hands of rogues. That is why I thought it my duty to try and help him as Pavlicheff's son. In the first place, by rescuing him from the influence of Tchebaroff, and secondly, by making myself his friend. I have resolved to give him 10,000 roubles. That is about the sum which I calculate that Pavlicheff must have spent on me." "What? Only 10,000?" cried Hippolyte. "Well, prince, your arithmetic is not up to much, or else you are mighty clever at it, though you affect the air of a simpleton," said Lebedeff's nephew. "I will not accept 10,000 roubles," said Burdovsky. "Accept, Antip," whispered the boxer eagerly, leaning past the back of Hippolyte's chair to give his friend this piece of advice. "Take it for the present. We can see about more later on." "Look here, Mr. Myshkin," shouted Hippolyte. "Please understand that we are not fools, nor idiots, as your guests seem to imagine. These ladies who look upon us with such scorn, and especially this fine gentleman," pointing to Evgenie Pavlovitch, "whom I have not the honour of knowing, though I think I have heard some talk about him." "Really, really, gentlemen," cried the prince in great agitation, "you are misunderstanding me again. In the first place, Mr. Keller, you have greatly overestimated my fortune in your article. I am far from being a millionaire. I have barely a tenth of what you suppose. Secondly, my treatment in Switzerland was very far from costing tens of thousands of roubles. Schneider received 600 roubles a year, and he was only paid for the first 3 years. As to the pretty governesses whom Pavlicheff is supposed to have brought from Paris, they only exist in Mr. Keller's imagination. It is another calumny.
According to my calculations, the sum spent on me was very considerably under 10,000 roubles. But I decided on that sum, and you must admit that in paying a debt I could not offer Mr. Burdovsky more, however kindly disposed I might be towards him. Delicacy forbids it. I should seem to be offering him charity instead of rightful payment. I don't know how you cannot see that, gentlemen. Besides, I had no intention of leaving the matter there. I meant to intervene amicably later on and help to improve poor Mr. Burdovsky's position. It is clear that he has been deceived, or he would never have agreed to anything so vile as the scandalous revelations about his mother in Mr. Keller's article. But, gentlemen, why are you getting angry again? Are we never to come to an understanding? Well, the event has proved me right. I have just seen with my own eyes the proof that my conjecture was correct, he added with increasing eagerness. He meant to calm his hearers, and did not perceive that his words had only increased their irritation. "What do you mean? What are you convinced of?" they demanded angrily. "In the first place, I have had the opportunity of getting a correct idea of Mr. Burdovsky. I see what he is for myself. He is an innocent man, deceived by everyone, a defenceless victim who deserves indulgence. Secondly, Gavrila Ardalionovitch, in whose hands I had placed the matter, had his first interview with me barely an hour ago. I had not heard from him for some time, as I was away, and have been ill for 3 days since my return to St. Petersburg. He tells me that he has exposed the designs of Tchebarov, and has proof that justifies my opinion of him. I know, gentlemen, that many people think me an idiot. Counting upon my reputation as a man whose purse strings are easily loosened, Tchebarov thought it would be a simple matter to fleece me, especially by trading on my gratitude to Pavlichev. But the main point is, listen, gentlemen, let me finish. The main point is that Mr. Burdovsky is not Pavlichev's son at all. Gavrila Ardalionovitch has just told me of his discovery, and assures me that he has positive proofs. Well, what do you think of that? It is scarcely credible, even after all the tricks that have been played upon me. Please note that we have positive proofs. I can hardly believe it myself, I assure you. I do not yet believe it. I am still doubtful, because Gavrila Ardalionovitch has not had time to go into details. But there can be no further doubt that Tchebarov is a rogue. He has deceived poor Mr. Burdovsky, and all of you gentlemen who have come forward so nobly to support your friend. He evidently needs support, I quite see that. He has abused your credulity, and involved you all in an attempted fraud, for when all is said and done, this claim is nothing else." "What, a fraud? What, he is not Pavlichev's son? Impossible!" These exclamations but feebly expressed the profound bewilderment into which the prince's words had plunged Burdovsky's companions. "Certainly it is a fraud. Since Mr. Burdovsky is not Pavlichev's son, his claim is neither more nor less than attempted fraud, supposing, of course, that he had known the truth. But the fact is that he has been deceived. I insist on this point in order to justify him. I repeat that his simple-mindedness makes him worthy of pity, and that he cannot stand alone, otherwise he would have behaved like a scoundrel in this matter. But I feel certain that he does not understand it. I was just the same myself before I went to Switzerland. I stammered incoherently. One tries to express oneself and cannot. I understand that. I am all the better able to pity Mr. Burdovsky, because I know from experience what it is to be like that, and so I have a right to speak. Well, though there is no such person as Pavlicheff's son, and it is all nothing but a humbug, yet will I keep to my decision, and I am prepared to give up 10,000 roubles in memory of Pavlicheff. Before Mr. Burdovsky made this claim, I proposed to found a school with this money, in memory of my benefactor. But I shall honour his memory quite as well by giving the 10,000 roubles to Mr. Burdovsky, because, though he was not Pavlicheff's son, he was treated almost as though he were. That is what gave a rogue the opportunity of deceiving him. He really did think himself Pavlicheff's son. Listen, gentlemen, this matter must be settled. Keep calm, do not get angry, and sit down. Gavrila Ardalionovitch will explain everything to you at once, and I confess that I am very anxious to hear all the details myself. He says that he has even been to Pskov to see your mother, Mr. Burdovsky. She is not dead, as the article which was just read to us makes out. Sit down, gentlemen, sit down. The prince sat down, and at length prevailed upon Burdovsky's company to do likewise. During the last 10 or 20 minutes, exasperated by continual interruptions, he had raised his voice and spoken with great vehemence. Now, no doubt, he bitterly regretted several words and expressions which had escaped him in his excitement. If he had not been driven beyond the limits of endurance, he would not have ventured to express certain conjectures so openly. He had no sooner sat down than his heart was torn by sharp remorse. Besides insulting Burdovsky with the supposition, made in the presence of witnesses, that he was suffering from the complaint for which he had himself been treated in Switzerland, he reproached himself with the grossest indelicacy in having offered him the 10,000 roubles before everyone. I ought to have waited till tomorrow and offered him the money when we were alone, thought Myshkin. Now it is too late, the mischief is done. Yes, I am an idiot, an absolute idiot, he said to himself, overcome with shame and regret. Till then, Gavrila Ardalionovitch had sat apart in silence. When the prince called upon him, he came and stood by his side, and in a calm, clear voice began to render an account of the mission confided to him. All conversation ceased instantly. Everyone, especially the Burdovsky party, listened with the utmost curiosity. End of Part 2, Chapter 8.